And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Welcome back to the TeachThought podcast, or if you're a first-time listener, welcome for the first time. If you are a first-time listener and perhaps not familiar with our websites, you can find us at teachthought.com or the professional development website, which is wegrowteachers.com. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the director of TeachThought Professional Development, and I'm happy to have you tune in. A few housekeeping notes. We have updated our professional development website and are continually tweaking our main teachthought.com website, so hopefully those sites are easier and more helpful for you. Also, excited to announce our TeachThought PBL Grow 19 event. Pre-registration is open. We'll be hosting that again in downtown Louisville, Kentucky at the Fraser History Museum. The dates we have planned are July 16th through 19th, and lots of details forthcoming. If you'd like to save your seat, because it is limited to 70 participants, go ahead and jump on over to wegrowteachers.com/grow19, and you can submit your email address and name, and we'll email you as soon as official registration opens, and of course your seat will be saved. We're also tentatively planning some other events in other locations in an effort to help teachers and educators around the world. So keep an eye out for those. You can sign up for our newsletters, email newsletters, and of course always keep an eye on wegrowteachers.com. Don't forget also, it's really helpful to leave reviews and share the podcast and links and social media pieces so that we can widen our audience and continue to have great guests and continue to have even better guests. So we appreciate any of those shares and likes, and if you have questions or comments, please feel free to email me at drew@teachthought.com. In this podcast episode, I spoke with Dr. Jared Cooney Horvath, who is an author and lecturer at the University of Melbourne. His new book is called Stop Talking and Start Influencing, and actually was meant to be, he thought, would be titled Stop Talking, Start Teaching, but of course publishers have different ideas. But for this audience, I think teaching is certainly a better fit, and I think influencing might sound a little less of a better fit for educators. But really interesting and fascinating conversation. Really kind of talked about the difference between teaching and learning, dived into the idea of learning taxonomies and deeper learning, then touched on bigger picture ideas like the purpose of school and how lots of policymakers and really I think parents are misunderstanding the purpose of school. Then we went on to kind of dive into his title as a lecturer. The pieces of his book we touched on were around multitasking, the idea of interleaving, which is something I had not heard about before, and kind of finished up talking about how errors and prediction and being wrong can be a real trigger to great learning. So again, really fascinating and interesting conversation. Really hit my sweet spot of teaching and learning and neuroscience as a former psychology teacher. So I hope you find it useful, and without further ado, here's Jared Cooney Horvath. Welcome, Jared. Nice to have you on the podcast. So, as I like to do, I'm going to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. You're connecting with me from almost exactly the other side of the world, Melbourne, Australia, and it's very early, and I appreciate you getting up early. So, tell us a little bit more about yourself before we get into the meat of your book and your work.
No worries. Well, first, thanks for having me on. So as you can tell, I'm American originally. So I was born in Pittsburgh. And I was originally a teacher. This was about 15 years ago is when I started teaching. But back when I was teaching, that's kind of when the neuroscience, the brain stuff started to become really popular. And I just remember having people come into the school all the time saying, buy this brain book and this brain product. And it all sounded cool. But when you'd ask them, what are you actually talking about? No one had any real clue what was going on. So it was like this cool buzz term, brain, with zero depth. So I decided the only way to kind of sort it out would be to go back and learn that information myself. So been in kind of academia, studying neuroscience on the medical side and on the academic side for about 12 years now. Went through Harvard and Harvard Med, and now I'm down here at the University of Melbourne. And the entire reason I've been doing this, what I now call science of learning, so neuroscience, psychology, economics, AI, all of these fields, to figure out how people learn so that I could come back to teachers and say, this is what it means. This is how we can use it. This is the good stuff. This is the fluff. So my passion is still 100% teaching, and I can't wait to get back into the classroom when all this is said and done. But the only reason I've been here is so I could come back and do this type of thing with you now and help other teachers kind of sort through all this nonsense.
Right. And you have a book coming out, or maybe out by the time we get this published and live, but it's called Stop Talking, Start Influencing, 12 Insights from Brain Science to Make Your Message Stick. And I'm looking at the text here, stop talking, and then you have a comma, and then upside down, start influencing, and I'm assuming that's on purpose.
That is all. Once you see, so you have a PDF copy. When you see the hard copy, the cover is one of those almost optical illusions where it's two faces upside down and then right side up. And so I was definitely going. So I've got kind of a 3-book cycle where I'm taking all the stuff that I've learned about the science of learning and packaging it up. And this is my first take on it. And one of the key things about human thought and learning is largely that our stories seem to guide everything. So we used to think kind of perception was first, and then interpretation and stories, understanding came later. But it turns out our stories guide what we can perceive. And a lot of the way we figured that out in neuroscience was through these kind of optical illusions. So I wanted to kind of make that an integral part of the book. So from the very front cover, things are a little trippy, meant to kind of play with your brain and get you thinking slightly differently. Right.
So before we get into the meat there, what did you teach when you were teaching?
I started teaching math year 8. And then, but I was at an international school. So it was a French school with about 30 English-speaking students. So after about a year, they essentially just gave me the 30 English-speaking students and said, go do what you want to. So from then on, I was teaching everything from English to geography. We'd go out and do science. So I kind of started free-flowing after that for about 4 years.
And you grew up, you said, in Pittsburgh. What was your K-12 experience like as a student?
Well, so born in Pittsburgh, kind of did most of my schooling in Denver, Colorado, and
that's a long commute.
It was my parents had to drive me; they were not happy. My dad got a job out there, so we moved out, and I remember loving it. To be honest, I don't know. I was one of those students that just seemed to enjoy the social aspect of school. So getting out of the house in the morning and coming back, I was just so happy to be there every day. And did decently as a student, but I didn't really. So everyone takes a look at my kind of tertiary education and says, oh, you must have been a really good student. No. It just, what I've learned since then is kind of the world of academia and really the world at large is just an open door, so long as you're willing to kind of make the right phone calls and email the right people. So I didn't really kick school's butt there, but once I decided I wanted to go back and get my master's and PhD, I found it was just really easy. Call the people you want to work with, call the schools you want to learn at, and 6 months later, you're there.
Yeah, so not to beat a dead horse here, but I think it's interesting because I was talking with a friend the other day, an educator, and she was saying something to the effect of talking about teachers and teaching and saying that we might be better off if we had more teachers who were C students in their sort of K-12 education because they're they're not because they're lacking in cognitive skills necessarily, but because quite the opposite, they're less compliant, more really interested in thinking and learning, perhaps. And like myself, I was very frustrated as a K-12 student, mostly towards the end of 12, by the lack of context and authenticity, and the work that we were doing seemed to me for the adults and for the institution. And it wasn't that I didn't want to learn, it was that I didn't really want to do that for them. I wanted to do it for me. So consequently, my transition from K-12 to college was, let's just say, a little delayed, because they said, well, thank you for your application, but we're not quite ready for you yet. So wondering how that transition went for you.
There was, for whatever reason, I didn't care too much about the uni transition, so I was just kind of happy to end up where I ended up. But the more I've kind of been in, so the last 12 years now, I've essentially been stuck in the black hole of academia. Mm-hmm. And I think you're spot on. What you notice is the people who make it there are the people who knew how to play the game really well. So school kind of made sense to them. So if you're looking for kind of educational reform, asking people who do really well in the current system to be the movers and shakers and the decision makers, probably not the smartest move you've ever made. It's a smart move if you want to make sure nothing changes. Mm-hmm. But if you really want to see some sort of reform, some sort of shift in the way we think and do things in schools, then I gotta say I agree with you. Because the people who are all the professors in the School of Education down here in Melbourne, they're all just flat thinkers, which isn't bad, but it just means what impetus would they have to try and come up with anything new? Mm-hmm. They already know how the system works. They know how to play it.
Right. Well, there's some interesting things as I was going through the book, and maybe this is something we can get to later, but I find it interesting. I had Barb Oakley, who is one of your, I guess, references, or I forget what the in the preface. I'm not getting the right word. Maybe you can help me with that. But she wrote a recommendation, and you have John Hattie, which is a person that many educators will be very familiar with. So maybe we can come back to, because I find I did a podcast with Barb, and we found lots of common ground in what we believe in thinking and learning, but she's much more heavy on practice and rote memorization. So maybe that'll come up, because I feel like there's a place for practice and rote memorization, but contextualizing it is a really important piece. But maybe that's a teaser for some conversation as this unfolds. So so let's so you have 12 principles here, and some of the things that I like about this is that you sort of lay out the science behind it, but then you also have sections here that are called implications for leaders, teachers, and coaches. So why in particular, so is the audience really geared towards educators?
Yeah, so the original name of the book was Stop Talking, Start Teaching. And it was geared 100% towards us, towards teachers. But of course, once you get a publisher, the first thing they say is, if you put the word teaching in the cover of a book, no one is going to touch it. So that's why it's kind of expanded out now. So it's built for teachers, but now it's expanded out to teachers kind of at all levels. So if you're a coach of a sports team, if you're a trainer at, say, for new employees at a business, it kind of gears into all those directions as well now. But at the end of the day, the principles are still the same. Let's take a look at 12 principles of how human beings learn, so that we can kind of use that information to guide and gear our teaching practices. And the way I always say it too is teachers are experts. Nobody seems to give teachers credit for what they know and what they do on a day-to-day basis. So one of the key things I wanted to do with this book was make sure that I'm not preaching a how-to guide to say, okay, and this is where me and say someone like Hattie really start to clash. Is Hattie seems totally fine with saying, here's the 10 things you need to be doing to teach well. Mm-hmm. Whereas I say, no, you already know how to teach. What I want to do is I want to teach you the science of learning, which is very different than the craft of teaching. The idea being that the more you know why patterns work, you've already seen these patterns in your classroom every day. But if I can put words to it, if I can put a mechanism to it, then you can start to own those techniques that you use a little bit better. So I always say the best thing that this book can do is if after every chapter you read, you go, oh, is that why my kids do blank? Or, oh, is that why this works blank? You know all this stuff already. I just want to give you the science behind it so you can own it a little bit better. That's my thinking behind this.
Interesting. And I find so I use the terminology teaching and learning in lots of different ways, but I lots of times use them together, knowing that they're very different, but they're obviously so closely related. So beyond the obvious, I mean, teaching is teaching and learning is learning. It's sort of, a transaction in a sense, but it's really not that when we look at the complexity. So is there a better way that you can describe that relationship?
Well, that's where, all of our understanding about learning will necessarily come from the individual level, whereas exactly what you said, everything about teaching is necessarily social. And what tends to happen is as you move through what we call levels of organization, so I move from a brain into a person, then I move from a person into a group of people, new properties, new things start to emerge that simply don't make sense before that. So if I talk about emotions, believe it or not, emotions don't exist in the brain. If all I had was a brain in a vat, there are no emotions. Emotions only make sense to start talking about once you have a brain with a body and you get to the level of a person. So if education is largely an interaction, at any level it's somehow an interaction between two people. And I don't care where that's at. Reading a book is an interaction between you and the author. So at some level it's always interactive, which means there's going to be a lot of emergent properties that simply don't make sense at the individual person level. Yet learning takes place at the person level. So all of our theories about learning, about how human beings take in, embody, and use information, they're all completely correct if the entire world was one person. But knowing that doesn't necessarily tell me how to teach a group of children. So this is where I think people like me and Barb and John and Robert Marzano, all of us kind of start to veer slightly differently, in that I can take the science of learning at the individual level and say, cool, this is how people learn, but now we need to adapt that for the different purposes of teaching. So we know that people have to start by taking in facts, and then they can move through deep learning, which is conceptualization and application. But just because I know that you have to move through that trajectory from facts to concepts to shifting concepts to applying concepts to transfer, that doesn't dictate that that's how I should teach. I need to know at the end of the day that those 5 steps are ticked in that order, otherwise learning doesn't happen. But as a teacher, that doesn't mean Monday I do shallow learning, Tuesday I do deep 1, Wednesday I do deep 2. I've got a ton of other things I've got to think about, so I'm constantly dancing. And that's why I say teachers are experts. Nobody devotes as much time, effort, thought to that practice of social interaction of learning, and combining the goals of learning with well-being, with personalization, with socialization. Nobody does that besides teachers. So why we don't recognize that what they do is completely unique and they're the experts we should be turning to when wondering how to do this, that's so beyond me. Why that respect isn't shown for that field, I don't know.
It's really interesting and does highlight, and I've said this a number of times on the podcast, I taught for 15 years. I volunteered in my daughter's classroom last year, co-teaching, and I very much enjoyed it, but was instantly reminded that how difficult it is and how people really don't seem to understand. And part of that problem, I think, is because there are lots of people that are adults now that were probably exposed to education. Now, you're saying teaching and teachers are experts that's a pretty broad generalization. There are unfortunately lots of schools and teachers who don't engage in really great teaching. Most are trying, most are wanting to do that. Lots of them do, but there are certainly some that don't. So lots of adults, sort of live by this idea that it's, well, they just put this information out there, it's my job to learn it and then spit it back and then move on, which is not what we're talking about. So as you were talking, I'm sort of pulling on these threads and thinking, wow, this opens up lots of questions. One of them being how you think about taxonomies like Bloom's taxonomy and other useful tools like that.
What I love is I always say, look, there's never been a single learning theory that's wrong. Everything anyone has ever said about learning is correct. The only thing that's different about them is they're talking about different levels of learning. So if you take Solow's and Bloom's, they're totally right. That is how we think. And now neurologically, I can go through the process of that, but it's incredibly tedious, so I won't bore you with it. But all those taxonomies, even back to Piaget, totally true. You have to start at a certain level before you can move to the next level, before you can move to the next level. So now take someone like Hattie versus somebody like Cultures of Thinking versus somebody like Marzano versus all these different people who have what appear to be completely different ideas about teaching and learning. No, they're all completely correct. They're just talking at different levels. So somebody like Hattie, all the research he used to create visible learning is necessarily done in labs, which means it's stuck at surface level learning. So when you're at that level, so the very earliest stage of, say, Solo, cool, take all of Hattie's stuff, use it, apply it, have a good time. But as soon as you move to the next level of Solo, you can throw visible learning in the fireplace because it has nothing to say anymore. And this is where something like now Cultures of Thinking out of Project Zero, that's where that now starts to make sense. Believe it or not, Cultures of Thinking routines have nothing to say about surface knowledge, have nothing to say about transfer. They speak directly at deep 1, deep 2, deep 3. So I think as teachers, our job isn't to say, okay, we're looking for the right answer. Our job is to recognize that it's all correct. Our job is to figure out how do we align this with the outcomes we want. Where am I at on the trajectory? Where am I at on Solo or Bloom's? And which are the techniques, strategies, learning frameworks that make sense there? So it's not that there's a right or a wrong one. It's about knowing when each one applies and when each one just becomes complete noise, essentially.
So is Bloom's, because I really find lots of value in Bloom's because it feels like it allows you to traverse all of those things. Does that resonate with you, or is it not?
Yeah, and absolutely. And so now you've got to say, okay, as teachers, believe it or not, learning isn't our only outcome as teachers. We've got a ton of outcomes we want to play with, and not the least of which is engagement. Look, if I can't even get you excited, best of luck trying to get you to walk through. And so there's where someone like Bloom's who says, okay, eventually you're going to have to tick all these boxes. You can't jump into transfer before you know what the heck you're talking about. You can't apply your skills until you know the facts. But you're free to jump across all these different barriers for different purposes. So Bloom will say, look, start here in the middle because you want to engage, intrigue them, and then jump back to this level, and then jump up to this one. So I think those taxonomies are awesome to remind us, to get us thinking about, cool, what am I doing and why am I doing it? And that's the big thing that I think kind of lacks in most of the teaching frameworks. So now I'm going back to, say, the Hatties and such, is that they don't understand the outcome. They never explicate the outcome. They just assume that my function for everything I do as a teacher is so the kid learns. And I'm sorry, but I'd be lucky if maybe 1 day out of 5, that's my only goal. I've got so many other goals that I'm playing with. And at that point, if you don't even know why I'm teaching, then don't presume to tell me how to teach. Tell me how people learn, give me the information you know, and then let me do my job.
So I'm not familiar with the Solo that you're referring to in Deep 1, Deep 2, I'm assuming are part of that. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so essentially if you take the learning trajectory, you can say everyone starts at surface, which is intake of facts. And the idea of surface learning is eventually you have to take facts and you have to turn them into semantic knowledge. So anytime you learn something new, that information comes in at what's called as an episodic memory. Essentially, it's tied to the time and the place that you first learned it. which is awesome. But it means if you ever want to use that information in the future, you have to mentally transport yourself back to that time and place and say, oh, yeah, we talked about that on Tuesday afternoon in that one classroom. I remember that.
So it's state dependent.
Exactly. Now, so the idea of surface learning is you want to take the key facts, the key information, and make it context independent. And the only way to do that is you have to build a certain amount of, say, episodic memories. So this is where that repetition comes in. I have to see it on Tuesday. I have to play with it on Wednesday. I have to build a book on Thursday. And as I build all these episodic memories, I can create what's called a semantic fact, which is now a standalone idea in my head. That fact is now there, accessible whenever, however. And that's surface learning. Once you have the facts, then you get to start moving through the levels of deep. And there's about 3 levels of deep, we say. I think in solo, it's the terms they use are extended abstract. I forget the terms. That's why I just say deep 1, deep 2, deep 3.
I'm looking at, is it johnbiggs.com.au, and he's got a diagram or an image of the solo taxonomy, and the furthest one on the right is extended abstract, and then going back to left, which I'm assuming is less deep, would be relational, multistructural, unistructural, and prestructural being the first. Is that what you're talking about? Or am I missing?
Bingo.
Okay.
Yep. And what's funny is you could layer that right next to Piaget, right next to Bloom's, and they all say the same exact thing.
Yeah. Okay.
It's just essentially I'm moving through this trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I say there's levels of deep, essentially what you start to recognize is, so deep level 1 is when you start forming concepts. And so a concept is essentially, how am I going to group facts? Facts by their very nature are right, wrong, yes, no, black, white, on, off. So when you say the capital of the U.S. is Washington, D.C., that's a fact, because either yes, you got it, or no, you didn't. Mm-hmm. A concept is simply, how am I grouping facts together? So concepts, by their very nature, can't be right, wrong. They're simply organizing principles. So it's if a fact is the capital of the U.S. is D.C., then a concept is, okay, what do I mean by world capital or state capital? What is a capital city? Here now, I can't be right, wrong. So you see where somebody like John Hattie, Visible Thinking, or even Marzano to some extent, at this point they become meaningless, because all the research used to devise their theories of teaching and learning were predicated on tests of right, wrong, yes, no answers. And no fault of their own, it's just that's how we measure things in science. I need to have it right, wrong. But once you move into deep 1, which is there can no longer be a yes-no answer, then you have to take all the yes-no research and say, thank you, back to the cupboard with you, what's next? And so here's where you start to see, this is where like cultures of thinking come in. But if you even take something like the International Baccalaureate or project-based learning, which are predicated on concepts, concept-based learning, they start here at deep level 1. And one of the big problems and issues we've always seen with concept-based, project-based learning is if you start here but never go back to look at the facts, you get highly confused outcomes. So concept-based learning only really starts to make sense as a learning tool once you've gone through surface. If you skip surface and jump right in, you don't know what kids are taking in, you don't know how they're organizing it, and a lot of the time they'll come out with a lack of information. Whereas if you would have just taken 2 days at the beginning to say, okay, we're going to do some of the surface-based learning, now let's open the project, now they have something to play with. So it's just about organizing the tools. Every tool is correct. It's just, where does it align on the trajectory, and where are we at on that trajectory?
Well, that is certainly in the wheelhouse of the work that we do, and lots of the questions that we get are kind of what you're talking about. So let's kind of pull on that thread a little bit here, because that was one of the major points of discussion that I had with Barb. And I am a big proponent of project-based learning, and think that it is a really, when it's done well, a really amazing way to build deeper learning. And so as I think about it, and the way that you described it there is reminds me of how some teachers might approach it, and so I'm curious to see how you react to this. They would say, oh, we need to front load some things before we start our project. My intuition and my experience tells me that if we design it well and facilitate it well, which is a big if, is that we start, if we're going to go back to using Bloom's taxonomy, start at the top of Bloom's taxonomy, which is create now, and ask them to design, develop, whatever that verb is with your driving question, and then we want to use that, and I call it pull teaching instead of push teaching. So what are the things that we need to know and learn and be able to do in order to create this, to develop it or whatever, right? And so using that inquiry process to identify, and teachers need to know how to do this, and sometimes it's a struggle, is how do we make sure that those things that are knowledge and understanding, those basic things, that teachers sometimes think we have to front load those. They say, I say, let's get those up on our need to know list, which now gives us a reason. And essentially the ideal is that we're after is that students are saying, hey, I need to know more about Washington, D.C., or whatever the facts are, right? In addition to some other things. And now we're using those pieces of knowledge in ways as we're going through and analyzing them and applying them and all that kind of thing. So how does that jive with the way that you phrased it?
You just nailed it. That, to me, that is a teacher being a teacher. When I say that learning and teaching are different, you just nailed it in that description. So if all I was doing was learning, then I would start with the facts, move through concepts, move through these. But what you've just said is, look, I can't do that. If I do that as a teacher, no kid is going to give a crap. So if all I do is spend every day front loading and then opening up projects, most kids are going to completely disengage. But if I start at the create level, what I can do is intrigue them. So believe it or not, I don't know if you noticed this, but when you were starting at create, your goal wasn't to teach the kids. You didn't start at create with the idea of saying, okay, you're going to know everything at the end of this. You started with create to inspire the kids to ask the right questions to get them to want to go back to the surface and pull in the facts.
Right.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's teaching. So we know learning is a certain process, but to get people to go through that learning process is a completely different craft. And I think what you've just done is brilliant. I try and do that very same thing where open with a question, open with a prompt, open with something confusing. Get them confused, debating, and talking. Not because that's the lesson, but because I want you so curious that when I say, okay, well, what do we need to know to start addressing this? You start taking agency of the learning process. And now you jump back to surface because you have a goal in mind where you want to apply that surface knowledge. So I think what you just did was absolutely perfect. You don't need to front load facts if you can find a way to so you don't have to front load facts, but you do eventually they're going to have to make an appearance at some point.
Right.
And you know that the project, eventually the creation is going to be a lot deeper, a lot better, a lot more aligned with the larger goals of learning once those facts do make an appearance. So that we're going to have to tick all the boxes. It's just how are we going to dance them through it so that they're engaged and really genuinely want to do it themselves.
Yeah, and so so the way that you said it makes sense to me. One of the things that we get pushback, and somebody might hear you say that we're starting at create not because we're going to try to get that, not because of the surface stuff, but we are in instructional design starting at create in a way to give context to those surface things, those knowledge, that basic stuff. So that's a real skill, and that's so it's instructional design, and we talk about the science of learning. And I differentiate and say the science of teaching and then the art of teaching. So designing it, architecting your work, your lesson, your unit, what you want to call it, project-based learning, whatever you want to call it, in a way that will allow you to demonstrate the art. So that's the science, is you can demonstrate the art and know when to ask that question, when to provide a little bit more information because they're reaching that level of productive struggle or passing it perhaps. And so that's a really important piece. And I'm almost I'm becoming more convinced that getting teachers to engage in what we call rich inquiry experiences, really powerful inquiry experiences, not pedagogy specific, not project-based learning specific, but really sort of getting that light bulb to turn on. We're like, oh wow, this is really powerful. Like that seems like it's a gateway into somebody going, oh, well, I can do this in my classroom, and I need to know more about that.
And that's where I think experience then really starts to play in, is the more you experience as a teacher, the more you have to draw on. And I think what you're talking about resonates so much with me in that we still have this really weird belief in teaching and education that there is an answer. And I think a lot of teachers are so browbeaten and scared that they're like, okay, tell me what to do. So they'll take something like the IB and they'll just try and follow it to a T. When what you're saying is, no, what we do is we experience as much as we can so we know when to draw on certain techniques, when to make different shifts, when we're going off the rails, when to jump in, when to let kids alone. And those things necessarily say, look, there is no answer here. At the end of the day, you're the designer. You need to take ownership of that expertise and dance and play. And you know what? You're going to screw up. Cool. Love it. Live in those failures, because that's how we're going to get to the next level. And that's why I can, with a completely 100% faith, say teachers are experts, because no one has spent as much time in a classroom as them playing this game. And until they recognize that those skills are very unique, and trust me, the rest of the world doesn't get that at all. They think all you do is sit there and talk. Without the world getting it, you've got to step up and say, well, cool, this is what I do, which makes me now as a teacher want to experience so much more. Now, once I start to realize, okay, I have agency, ownership, expertise over this craft, what other tools can I access? And now I want to go take a PL on project-based learning. Now I want to embed myself in some higher order thinking, because those are tools I can bring back to my craft. I love this. I think you're spot on. I think we have the very similar idea about kind of the breadth of teaching and how cool and broad and crazy it can get.
Well, clearly you're genius then.
Yay!
So you've used the word expert quite a few times, but then you just used the word expertise, which I think is there's a pretty fundamental difference in that, and it's been on my list of things to do to perhaps write a blog piece sort of highlighting what I think is the difference, because I think teachers, and I'm very uncomfortable when I'm introduced as an expert, for example, in project-based learning, because I think about the dynamic of being an expert is that supposedly, or in somebody's mind, I have all the answers, whereas expertise kind of gets at that experience. And I certainly have thought a lot about project-based learning. I'm not always right about it, about teaching and learning, but I have lots of experience and hopefully some wisdom and have thought about it a lot. And so is that how you would make that distinction?
Yeah, that's essentially where I boil down to it so I'm happy to use the term expertise instead. To me, an expert is somebody who devotes their time and effort and energy to a specific thing. There are no answers to it. There can be no expert in what's the capital of the U.S. because everyone either knows it or they don't. An expert just knows how to think within a field. So when you say I'm an expert neuroscientist, cool. Mm-hmm. Does that mean I know everything about the brain? Heck no.
Right.
Does that mean I can think about the brain and find answers? Absolutely. Does that mean I know how to ask the questions and develop new information and knowledge in that field? Absolutely. So teachers know how to think like teachers. No one else does, which means that gives them expertise, I suppose, in that craft. And that's why I always giggle. I was just at a government meeting the other day for curriculum. There were about 100 people in the room, and we're all talking about, what do we want to do for education? What's the next generation going to look like? And about a half hour in, I raised my hand. I said, excuse me, real quick, are any of you guys teachers? 100 people in a room. Guess how many were ever teachers?
I think I know the answer, unfortunately.
It was so that's why I said, don't you guys think this is a bit of an issue? We got lawyers, we got politicians, we got neuroscientists. None of us know how to think like teachers. Isn't this a problem? And after a big debate, they all came out saying, no, that's okay. What do they do? They're just cogs in a machine. But that's where we realized that, no, there's a field there. And I would rather take a teacher that's been in a classroom, the worst teacher that's been teaching for 10 years, over the best neuroscientist any day of the week to teach my kids. It's the same thing with dentists, man. The worst dentist is going to be better than the best plumber when it comes time to drilling a cavity. And that's purely because they've been in the field. That's what they think about. So are there different levels? Yes. Is every teacher equally effective? No. There's going to be some people who are more effective than others.
Right.
But do they all have expertise in the field? A whole heck of a lot more than the politicians I have to work with.
Yeah, it's really so frustrating to me when we think about policymakers and those folks who make lots of decisions for and about our schools. And I extend that to parents. And I've said this a number of times. I think that if parents, who are, of course, voters, who would then make changes or demand differently from policymakers, if they knew what teaching and learning could look like and probably should look like, then our schools would be tremendously different. It's easy to say, oh, I'm in favor of education and, every kid should go to school every single day and all those sort of simple things. But really, and I like the way you put it there, like they don't often have, and not enough, have the ability to think like a teacher. And so I think, man, if we could get people to think like a teacher and understand what that really means, I think we would be making progress in education reform. So when you talk about curriculum, you mentioned curriculum. What kind of things do you think we should do? I know you're in Australia, but I know that in our work, we work internationally, and I hear some of the same conversations in Brazil that I'm likely to hear in Ecuador next month, and in school in Pakistan. So, curriculum-wise, what does that look like for you going forward, or should look like?
That is a really good question. So the way I kind of see it is, I'm not one of the proponents that everything is broken. I think the pendulum can swing way too far, way too fast when people are like, let's just completely overhaul. If education were inherently broken, there's no way in heck we would have gotten this far for thousands of years using very similar techniques. Socratic dialogue, it's still around because it works.
Right.
So I'm not a huge fan of let's just scrap it all and start from scratch. I think 85% is fine. It's what are we doing around the edges that we can tweak to just make it better for everyone. And the only thing I keep coming back to is so when I say we were having a curriculum meeting, largely the debate was about what topics do we need to teach. Mm-hmm. And frankly, I couldn't care less about that. I definitely, beyond reading, writing, arithmetic, everything is just kind of, what do we need to learn today? I don't know. If I set the standard today that you have to know about, I don't know, something like global warming, and now that's in the thing, and in 20 years that's not an issue. I'm not saying that it won't be, but why would I set that in stone today when I don't know if that's even going to be of importance tomorrow? So I really don't. My debates are very little on that field of what content should we be covering. I much more care about what are we going to do with it? What experiences are we trying to generate in these kids? What outcomes do you genuinely want in your students? And if one of those outcomes is I want them to know about the history of the Australian people and our current culture, cool, that's an outcome. We can link content to that later. I just need to know what specifically you want a graduate of your school to look like. Mm-hmm. And I think this is where then we can start to get fun, where we go, cool, teaching and learning is fine. All we got to do is tweak the edges to say, I want a kid that comes out with agency. Brilliant. Now we can teach them about learning. We have to somehow get them agency over their own learning process. I want a kid that comes out with self-confidence who's not harming themselves. Cool. Well, now we can embed well-being into the classroom. So I'm much more an outcome-oriented focused guy than I am a content. But unfortunately, when I say curriculum, the definition of curriculum here seems to be purely the content we're trying to teach. So, heck if I know what that answer is going to be.
Well, I mean, that is almost one of the biggest problems in a nutshell, right? So I keep saying we're asking the wrong questions, and it tends to get to be around they need this list of knowledge. And I don't deny that kids and adults need lots of knowledge, and we can talk about the difference between knowledge and understanding. I think understanding is really more important than just knowledge. You need knowledge to understand things, but there's lots of things we know about that we don't understand. So that in and of itself is a problem. But I'm with you as far as like outcomes. So one of the things I taught was U.S. history, and I still think that we have taught U.S. history, for example, we've done it a disservice in so many ways by, first of all, making it a separate class, because to me, it then it tends to devolve into sort of this march through history, right? And there are some teachers who do a better job with it and get students to really engage in the stories and the passion, and there's lots to be said there. But to me, say, well, why do we teach history? Well, the go-to answer is so that we don't repeat it. Well, we do that, so we're obviously failing miserably. So the idea really, I think, is that we want people to be better citizens. To be in a democratic society, we need them to be good citizens, and I say good not in obedient, but in fully well-functioning. And to do that, you need to really understand history. You can't be a well-informed, active citizen in a way that's meaningful without knowing much about history. Unfortunately, there's lots of people who are trying to be well-meaning, active citizens without understanding history. And so we're making decisions and votes and electing people and arguing about things, and it's like, what in the heck are we doing here? So why are we not teaching classes about how to be a good citizen instead of U.S. history, for example?
Boom. And that's it. See, you nailed it. It's the purpose of education. What we'll call the end of education. Essentially, why are we doing this?
Right.
And there's a massive disconnect between, so I've been working with teachers now, so let's say a couple thousand teachers in the last 10 years I've worked with. And I'll ask them all, why do you teach? What's your purpose? Why do you get out of bed in the morning? None of them have ever put down so that my kids can get a job. But as soon as you go to the government, they assume the purpose of education is to make kids employable. So they come back with saying, okay, employees want creative kids, so you need to make sure your kids are creative. Here's the competencies we want. And it's like, no. Not only, I can't tell you, I must have taught, I'm trying to think of, if you take all my students over the years, I must be around, 5,000 through university. I couldn't tell you what any of them do as a job, because I don't care. That was never my purpose. My purpose as a teacher was to get them to start to question and think like a scientist. If you take a neuroscience course with me, I always know you're ready to graduate when you start arguing with me and say, but wait a second, what about this? What about this? That's all I want. I want you to be able to question everything. If that leads to a job, great, good on you. If that leads to you moving away and having kids and never working a day in your life, great, good on you. I don't care. So we have this real cross purpose between the government and academics, who think the entire purpose of an education is to employ kids, and teachers where, like you just said, no, the purpose of me teaching history is to build good citizens. So how do I go about building a good citizen? And that might mean they're employed, but that's not really what I'm caring about. So if we go down this competency route, it's such a dead end, where it's like, I want a critical thinker, I want a creative kid. How? What does that even mean? I can't teach creativity. If you know what that means, then cool, go build a class and teach kids creativity yourself. Don't make that my goal. And so now I'm thinking, if we go back to that issue of curriculum, cool, maybe the one thing we need to change then, outside of of really nailing home the purpose, the reason, what is it we hope the kids get, is then maybe alignment is, okay, we teach history in isolation, but there's no reason we have to, and frankly, there's no reason we should. How do we align vertically and horizontally so all year 9 classes, whatever they are somehow on the same path and trajectory? And every year 9 teacher knows what every other year 9 teacher is doing, and it's all working together. And then vertically, so that all year 10 students or teachers know what they were doing in year 9 and 8. So if we say, okay, 85% of education isn't broken, maybe the remaining 15% that we need to tweak is just this concept like you were talking about of alignment, of teaching not isolated topics, but big, complete, full education where every class leads into the next class and is pushing the same general ideas. We're building a good citizen. We're building self-confidence. We're building agency in the learning process. So maybe that is the secret I've been looking for, is this concept of alignment.
Yeah, well, we just really try to stress in all of our professional development efforts, and when I talk with schools and leaders of schools, really trying to root the work that they're doing, and I think this is true of teachers too. What's your mission, right? So we have mission statements, and usually they're just platitudes that go unnoticed in a frame in some boardroom. But What is that mission or purpose, right? And so let's really clarify that. And then actually what we prefer to do is turn that into a mission question and start to do just what we talked about. So if your mission is this, and you say, how can we do that? How can we get there? What are the things we need to know and learn and be doing in order to do that? What's our vision? What does it look like, sound like, feel like? How is that going to look in our schools and in our classrooms, right? And then what are the actions that we need to take? So we actually call the PD alignment and refinement process. So then you're constantly always critiquing, looking back, say, all right, so how well did our actions, our professional development, our teaching, whatever level you're looking at, actually help us achieve our goal, our purpose, right? So that it is that purpose-driven stuff. And I posted on Twitter recently something I was reading in Fast Company magazine. I thought it was really, really thoughtful, because there's I think a saying, something like, culture eats climate for breakfast, or something like that. So somebody, I don't know her name. I don't know who she is. Whitney Wall-Hurd is her name, but it was, I think they had an innovation festival and they were quoting things, and she said, mission eats culture for breakfast. You have to have purpose. And that's exactly right. Yeah. Like, it's so important for people. I know Simon Sinek saying, you have to know your why, but if you don't know what you're doing, it's just sort of you're flopping about and flailing about. And we see it in classrooms, we see it in schools and professional development, which is, you have disparate things, and teachers know this, and kids know it. Kids know, like, I'm not sure why I'm learning this and what's going on here and how it's connected to anything else. And teachers know it when there's a new PD thing, because it's like, oh, this is happening, and it might happen and it might not continue, and then there'll be a new thing. And so it's like, how do we, if we can just really focus on purpose and really align those things, our work would be so much more powerful. And
this is where, so my favorite motto was always, it comes from architecture. It was late 1800s, the guy who invented the skyscraper, Louis Sullivan, he used to say form follows function. And he was the guy who then trained Frank Lloyd Wright, and that was his big thing. Form follows function. Right. Don't start building a house until you know what you need that house to achieve. Right. Then go back. So it's and bring it all back. That's now back to the learning trajectories, to all these different how-to guides on teaching. Form follows function. Hattie, Marzano, all these people are fantastic only when you know what you need to achieve. Because once you know the function, then you can go back and say, cool, does this meet my function? If it does, then that's usable in this moment. If it doesn't, then it might be great, but time to scrap that and move on to the next thing. Right. And there's where the decisions start to come in. So start with your function. Everything else starts to click into place so easily after that. And I think, to be honest, that's the big disconnect. If the government thinks that the function of education is to get kids jobs, then standardized testing and assessments make a whole heap of sense, because we need to rank kids according to career skills.
Mm-hmm.
But if that's not my function as a teacher, but I still have to give standardized tests, you start to see why I burn out. You start to see why teachers feel browbeaten and like, well, I don't know what I'm doing. They don't know what I'm doing. So what's the point of all of this?
Right.
There's a school I'm working with out here that after a lot of discussion, they decided, okay, in 2020, they're scrapping all tests. They're going to keep the standardized tests at the end, the ones that you need to do to get funding from the government. But they've decided the kids will never see the scores on that. So everyone will take the test, they'll send it to the government, get the money, but no one will ever know what those scores were. And beyond that, all standardized testing, everything else is scrapped. And they did this to try and give teachers a sense of agency again, to say, okay, now go back to your purpose. What would it look like for you? So an incredibly bold move, and I'm so impressed with them. But it turns out 4 of the teachers didn't get the memo that that was supposed to start in 2020, and they didn't give any test or assessment last year. So they thought it just started immediately. It was hilarious because at the end of the year, those 4 teachers, to a man, they all said, that was the best year of teaching of my life.
Right.
That reminded me why I got into this field. They reignited their passion. They all of a sudden connected with their students authentically again. And they were like, man, that was great. They then had to backtrack and try and give kids grades because they had screwed up and not assessed anyone. So they had to do this struggle bit at the end. But that just reminded, that's where I started to go, wait a second, that's the purpose again. When they were able to reconnect with their purpose and they weren't forced to use tools designed by somebody with a different purpose, teaching, learning boosted incredibly. They had fun, their students had fun, and they actually started to get stuff done. So maybe one of the big issues is just either A, getting the government to recognize our purpose is different than yours and we need to align with ours, or find a way to get the government to shift their purpose or just get rid of that, any cross purposes, and realign just with ours.
Well, I think it's an interesting dichotomy that, and to be clear, neither of us, I think I can speak for you here, it's not like we don't want kids to grow up and get jobs and be employable. That's not what we're saying. But actually, and this is the trust part, right? So I remember shifting my teaching, and I was never a heavily didactic teacher, but as a psychology teacher, I remember, and history teachers are notorious for this, but in psychology, I mean, it was a really fun course to teach because every kid has sort of some anecdotal story to riff off of in psychological concepts, right? So I could find myself almost performing, like in some days it was like a comedy routine, right? We're still learning and teaching, but it was still, I was a lot of the focus. And as I shifted my practice away from that, especially in the more core academic subjects, there was some fear, some anxiety around if I turn this over in a way that is more student-centered, will they actually be learning, or am I doing them a disservice? And it was liberating, and in the end, I think that we were learning what they had learned before in large part, but also gaining other skills and actually enjoyed the class and things like that. So it's not that a shift in practice or focusing more on the purpose of building capacity as learners and thinkers as opposed to employability skills will leave them unemployable, but it's that it's sort of like I say with content standards, like don't stare at them. Like knowledge is not the purpose of education, it's the byproduct of really good education.
Exactly. So say something like a job. Honestly, if my purpose was to get my kids a job, a K through 12 general education is probably the worst way to do that. I could get my kids a job guaranteed in a year if you just let me drill them, train them in a mentorship program. And any job I've ever gotten, I've had to spend a couple months training for that job. So it's not like they need to come out with the skills to do the work. They need to come out with the ability to learn, the ability to engage, so that when they go, the ability to go get a job. I think that was a great word. Employment is a byproduct of thinking and knowledge and love of learning. It's not the goal. Man, there's got to be a tons. If that was it, I'm telling you, let's go back to horseshoeing, and because that, if you train with, say, an electrician for 2 years, you'll have a job and you'll make better money than wasting 12 years in education.
Right.
Which means we must be here for something else.
Right. And to be fair, and I think this is one of the things that enters in the conversation that maybe we're sort of overlooking, is that there are a number of people, there is a need for people who are going to do jobs that don't necessarily require much thinking. Although I think that is slowly, although maybe more rapidly than slowly, it's changing as artificial intelligence will take those jobs first. So there are people who do have jobs and do work that is less career, more jobs, and certainly not requiring lots of deep thinking. That doesn't mean that we want more of those people necessarily, and it's not just that we're looking at them as workers, but also as people. And I use the example of here in 2008, the housing boom crisis, and how many people actually bought homes and signed up for mortgages that they had absolutely no business doing. And so the sort of habit of mind, if you will, the ability to be able to ask the right and great questions is one of the things that we want, I think, is important as a takeaway, right? So how do I think, here's what I'm trying to do, whether it's buying a house, buying a car, picking a school, looking for a mate, what are the things I need to know and learn and think about in order to do that well, as opposed to just going to an office and somebody says, here, sign this, you can afford this, and here's your keys. And then 6 years later, you have no house, you're bankrupt, and all of a sudden you're really in deep trouble.
Boom. If we were building employees, we could do it in 2 years. It's all useless. But we're not, like you said earlier, we're building citizens. We're building human beings.
Right.
So I don't care if you're going to be a plumber. I don't care if you're going to be CEO. I don't care if you're going to never work a day in your life. I'm building a human being. I want you to be able to think. I want you to be able to engage. That's the purpose of education. I want you to own you and feel like a part of the world around you and be able to change it however you want to.
Right.
That's what K through 12 is. Now you go do what you want to with it, but boom, I want you to be a citizen here, a contributing member of our world.
So one of the titles that you have is lecturer, which is a dirty word in education, right? So I know that, and we haven't talked about your book much, which in some sense is good because people should go buy the book and be able to get the glimpse inside your mind. But how do you think about lecturing? Because I know that some of the pieces, the 12 principles, kind of get at PowerPoint slides and reading and thinking and note-taking and things like that.
Yeah. So it turns out, so lecturer is an official title, unfortunately.
Right.
So at my level, you go lecturer to assistant professor. So when I say lecturer, it's a dirty word, but it is literally just a job title. It sucks, but in tertiary education, lecturing still exists. It's the number one way of teaching. Mm-hmm. And that's largely due to the fact that the people who run the courses simply don't have time. They make their money, make a living doing research, so they have to give up 12 hours of their life to teach. Easiest way to do that is to just stand there and talk for an hour. So lecturing, is it effective? Not necessarily, but can it be more effective? Yes. And so that's the kind of thing that I go through, in the book is, okay, if we know how people learn, what are some things we can do to make, if I'm lecturing, say, that more effective? If I have PowerPoint slides, how can I build those? How can I embed questions? How can I force people to make errors during a lesson to help them learn better? So if I'm stuck with this, and it sucks, but in tertiary education, we are still stuck with it. If I'm stuck with that, how can I make it better? And then I think that translates down to every teacher too, is cool. If I know how people learn that, so for instance, if you're taking notes, you can't listen to somebody speak while writing simultaneously. You simply can't do it. But at the same time, we know that if you take handwritten notes, you learn that material better than if you didn't take notes on it. So if we know that, okay, you can't listen while noting, but noting by hand is effective for learning, how can I use this knowledge to start to tweak my practices? Maybe I can embed note-taking into the session itself. Or maybe we do group notes at the end. Or maybe, I don't know, what ways can I start to play with these learning principles in my own context to make it work for me? And that's where now we kind of circle full back, where I say, I'll never tell the teacher how to teach. No one ever should. You know teaching. I don't know your context. You know. But if we can then use these principles of learning, okay, how do people learn? We can then apply those to help guide our practice, our decisions. So I'll never tell you how to teach. I'll simply tell you how people learn. And then you can use that knowledge to take more agency over your teaching. At least that's my goal.
Right. So one of so there's a couple of things that stand out here. And I like this quote. So number 5, for example, is multitasking, and you mentioned that before. I like the quote here that you have. Anyone who can drive safely while kissing is simply not giving the kiss the attention it deserves, and that's anonymous. I think I kissed anonymous before, but yeah. So we're multitasking is really not what we're doing. We're segmenting things. I mean, now we have so many more distractions. At least that's what everybody says, and social media and phones and all those things. So we're not multitasking.
No, you never can multitask. So this is a perfect example of say, science of learning. So in order to do any task, you have to access what's called the rule set of that task. And so this determines, what stimuli are important, which are blocked out, what rules I can do, what I shouldn't be doing. Unfortunately, the brain can only hold on to one rule set at a time. So you're only stuck doing one thing or another. And when we try and jump back and forth between tasks, what starts to happen is not only do we go slower because it takes time to change out that rule set, but we start to get confused. We start to mix rule sets up, which is why if you've ever been, say, talking on the phone while writing an email, you might start typing what you meant to be saying on the phone, or vice versa. We just start confusing the two. And then to make matters worse, the more we jump, all of our memories start to get pushed into a secondary memory network called the striatum, which means all the learning we do while multitasking essentially becomes subconscious and inaccessible. We can remember it, but it's really hard to access in the future. So this concept of multitasking, when you go down the list of what impact it's having, you start to realize it's a horrible, horrible way to learn. If I'm reading while texting, while watching TV, and we've got new data now that shows if you sit down for 45 minutes and focus on one task, so I don't know, let's just say it's studying a book. 45 minutes of focused study on a book will lead to 60% better memory for 6 months longer than if you do that same amount of work while multitasking for 5 hours. So essentially 5 hours of studying during multitasking, worse than 45 minutes of studying focused. And once kids start to recognize this fact that, look, all your hours and hours and hours of homework is due largely to the fact that you're not doing it right.
Right.
That if you're doing 6 hours of homework a night, you can learn better, do faster in 30 minutes than you can in those 6 hours. All you got to do is play the game right, know the rules, and game the system correctly.
Yeah, I remember. I noticed one of the anecdotes that you use in the book is talking about cramming and the value of, or the lack of value in cramming, and you note that cramming can certainly work. So really focusing on something for 12 hours before an exam will usually yield results on that exam. Whether it's going to be there long term is another question. But I remember, I think I crammed over, I did an overnighter one time in college, and I was it did, I think it helped. But my theory was more along what you talk about in the book, is really, if you just pay attention in meaningful ways throughout the course, then you really shouldn't have to cram. There really shouldn't be a need for that.
Well, start playing the game. So this concept of short, sweet, and spacing, right? If you do 30 minutes today and then 30 minutes on Wednesday and then 30 minutes on Friday, you're going to remember that stuff a ton better, a ton longer than if you do 3 hours just today.
Right.
And that has nothing more to do than with the fact that that's how the brain processes information. So at the end of every day, you're gonna forget essentially 80% of everything you learned that day. And that's just natural form. The brain saves energy by just ditching stuff. But the brain will start to hold on to things that come in repeatedly over several days. So if you just know that this is one of the rules of how memories are laid down, then congratulations, you can make your life a whole lot easier by blowing 90 minutes spread over 3 days instead of 12 hours over 1 day. And you can work. It sounds like a sales pitch, and I always found it sounds silly saying it, but once you know the rules of how to learn, then you can be a ton more efficient and effective with your learning and teaching. It's just a process. There's no magic behind it. Know the rules, game the system, and all of a sudden things become a ton easier, a ton faster for you.
Well, how do you think about mindfulness? Because this, to me, gets at some of the core thinking behind mindfulness, and I'm a big fan of it, which is really blocking out some of those things, and that's a really difficult thing to do. I find myself really struggling because of the availability of technology to be, if I'm reading a book, if I'm reading a magazine, there are sort of offshoot thoughts that I want to think about and learn more about, or figure out. So I quickly Google it, which then of course I'm on Twitter or whoever knows. But being mindful, and really I think there's lots to be said for learning with mindfulness and anxiety and emotional, all of those things.
Mindfulness and self-regulation, I think, are two biggies. The ability to recognize to allow yourself to be in the moment, recognize those thoughts, and then self-regulate your behaviors in response to those thoughts, I think is a huge skill. I think, unfortunately, and I don't know if this is the same over there, but down in Australia, mindfulness has kind of become synonymous with happiness. And so people have kind of confused mindfulness as, it's a meditative practice that makes you feel good. Well, no, it can, but that's not the point of mindfulness. Isn't happiness. The point of mindfulness is presence. And that might require you to feel slightly uncomfortable, to get a thought that goes, I need to look this up, and then regulate that thought to say, you know what, you can look it up in 30 minutes. If you still remember it, write it down in the margin, and if you still care in 30 minutes, look it up then. And stay here, stay focused, stay on the now with what task you've got going. Yeah. So I'm with you. I think mindfulness is a great skill. And if you really take it, what it boils down to then is metacognition. Right. It's knowing how you think, knowing how you learn, and then controlling that process. Right. And one of the only ways to gain metacognition, one way is you learn how to learn, but you also then get mindfulness. You learn how you think while you're learning. And you start to then organize and play with those thoughts. Yeah, and I think you're right. There's a misnomer. I don't know if there's the equivalence of happiness or being happy with mindfulness, but I would assume there's probably some of that. But yeah, it's not necessarily that you are trying to be happy. It's that you're recognizing, like you said, metacognition. So recognizing that you are having thoughts, and that you are thinking, and that you have emotions, and there are things that are bothersome, and that those things are real, and that we can be okay with that, right? And so it kind of gets towards that problem-centered focus and being able to think about things and how do I solve that problem and all that kind of stuff. So it is a very metacognitive piece. Yeah. One of the things that you have in here that I'm not familiar with is this concept of interleaving. Yeah. So interleaving is this idea that if I mix up things that I practice, I can have different results for those things. So the example I use kind of in the book is, let's say you're a tennis player, and every day you practice. Actually, I'm going to change it because I've taken up golf recently. So let me use golf as an example. Oh man, I suck at golf, by the way. Yeah. But so whenever I go to the driving range, whenever I go to the driving range now, I always start. I'll do like 10 balls with the driver, then I just kind of start working my way down. I go 3 iron, then 5 iron, then 9 iron. And it turns out if I practice in that same way every day, I build what's called kind of a meta chunk, where every time I go golfing, driver has to be first, then 3 iron, then 5 iron. But unfortunately, when I go out to actually play golf, almost never will I use a driver, then a 3, then a 9 in that order. You're always mixing and matching what you need to do. So if I practice in a very specific chunked order, always this, then this, it makes it incredibly difficult to go into the dirty, messy, chaotic real world where that pattern never actually happens. So interleaving says, okay, can you mix up your practice, make it more chaotic to match the circumstance that you're actually going to apply it in? So if I know that some skill I use, I want to keep it malleable, I want to keep it transferable, then I might be better mixing up that practice. So practice that skill for 10 minutes, then go to a different skill, then come back to it, then go to a different skill, then come back to it, as opposed to sitting there and just drilling that skill for an hour. But I think the important thing with interleaving is, it typically only works with practice. It doesn't really work with learning. If I'm learning a new skill, then I need to focus on it. Or if I'm trying to hone one particular aspect of a skill, then I need to deliberately practice it. But if the practice is maintenance, then this idea of interleaving, jumping, chopping and changing my skills makes a whole lot more sense, and I can keep skills more malleable and avoid having them just become routinized and difficult to access in the real world.
And then one of the other things that you note as a principle is the idea of errors, which I'm not. I think it's pretty typical now in the education conversation, sort of that fail forward idea. But kind of tell us a little bit more about that one.
So it turns out most of us live in a prediction, unfortunately. So anyone listening to this podcast right now, they're not actually hearing the words coming out of our mouth. They're about 1 to 2 seconds in front of us predicting the words that are going to come out. And so long as those words are even remotely close to what they expect, they live in that prediction. So you have to assume the vast majority of the time students are simply predicting. And so long as everything is close enough, cool, they never even recognize. So when they make mistakes, when they make errors, 9 times out of 10, they're never going to see it because the prediction just says, yep, that was close enough, don't even fret. What an error is there's a big enough discrepancy between my prediction and reality, or somebody has pointed out, and this is where feedback starts to come in, a discrepancy between my prediction and reality. And in that moment, I flip into what's called coder mode. Essentially, I zip into the present, my prediction shuts down, I get to this moment, my breathing slows down, my pupils dilate, my brain enters a mode called theta, and essentially the system says, okay, let's learn. So an error drives that process where the brain goes, if there's an error, if there's a big enough, if my prediction is wrong, we better fix the prediction, otherwise this could be dangerous. So errors force that moment. They essentially put us in the prime spot for learning. The whole system conspires to say time to learn. Now the problem is once you get into that moment, it typically feels uncomfortable. So most people hate that feeling. So we always say you got to learn to love that sensation. But B, you then enter into a choice, unfortunately. So you make an error, the coder kicks on, you're here, everything's ready to go. You can choose to engage with that, in which case learning starts to happen, the brain physically starts to change, or you could choose to ignore it. Essentially, you shut the alarm down, 72 hours later, you forget that error ever happened, and you go right back to your old prediction. And that's a pure choice. You can't choose if the error alarm goes off or not, but you can choose what to do with it, unfortunately. And most people, of course, will choose to avoid because it's uncomfortable. So what we look at in the book is A, that process, and then B, how do you depersonalize that sensation so students recognize, okay, that feeling, that gross, ugly coder feeling, that is the sensation of learning. Boom, this must be something I need to update. So to get them to seek that moment out and use that to drive learning. Because if you can get them into that mode, learning is so much faster and easier and deeper than it is if they're just taking in new information or living in their prediction. So as gross as it might feel, that is the fastest route to learning.
So you use the word choice and making choices, but there's also sort of an autonomic response there, right? I mean, how much of it is actual choice? Like I'm really making a choice.
Yeah, you can't choose for the error alarm to go off. So if you're driving and a deer jumps in front of your car, error alarm is going off come hell or high water. Unfortunately, at that point, you get to choose whether or not to engage with it. And when I say choose, I mean that is 100% conscious choice. In that moment, you can say, uh-oh, here's something I got to fix. And if you're driving, 9 times out of 10, you're going to fix it. But in the real world, most mistakes will be like spelling, or you got the wrong world capital, or your concept is a little short. Those errors, you then have a pure choice to say, yep, I'm 100% in or I'm 100% out. And it all boils down, so far as we can tell, to personalization. If you view that error as a reflection of your identity, most of the time you choose to ignore it. You protect your identity and you kill the error. But if you see the error not as a reflection of you personally, but just as, something else, oh, that's not my fault, that's the world's fault, then you choose to engage with it and update. So when I say that that's a choice, that becomes a pure conscious choice. You can't choose for the error alarm to go off. That's coming hell or high water. But once it's off, you get to choose what to do with it.
Nice. Well, I'm mindful of time, and I have one last question before I make sure that folks know where to find you, and we'll talk about make sure we get the title of the book and stuff out there. But speaking of books or I don't know, podcasts, movies, whatever, if you were going to gift somebody, a brand new teacher, let's say, a book or some sort of resource, is there something that you go, boy, outside of your own book, of course, to say, boy, this is a really powerful resource. Is there anything that you would gift or recommend?
Yeah, there are, believe it or not, there are only three books that I'll ever recommend. In 12, 15 years now of reading about science of learning and teaching, the only 3 books I've come across that I would share are, one, Why Don't Students Like School by Dan Willingham, which I think is just a fantastic book. And mine was modeled after his in that same kind of style. Different topics, but I loved the way he put that together. 2 is How People Learn. Not How We Learn by Benedict Carey. That book is not good. How People Learn is a really good source of cognitive learning theory. And then the 3rd book is The Brain That Changes Itself by Norman Doidge. It's one of the few popular science books that look at the brain that 15 years later still holds up. I read that book now, and I'm as excited about neuroscience as I was the first time I read that book.
That's dealing with neuroplasticity?
Yeah, bingo. So that was the first real book on neuroplasticity. And that was when I first read it, that's what got me really interested in the brain, and then saying, okay, well, screw it, I'm going to go do this. And most books on neuroplasticity especially just tank. It's one of the same with everything. Once you get into any field and you really learn it deeply, all the popular stuff you kind of go back to and you're like, oh, that's horrible, or oh, that's too simple. But this is one of those books that, as every other book falls off my radar, this stays there as still being good, inspirational, and powerful. So I love recommending that one as well.
Very cool. We will make sure to link to those in the show notes. So I'll make sure we get those up. If you're listening on iTunes or other places, the show notes on our websites, and some of the places actually push out the actual links. I don't think iTunes does, but his name is Dr. Jared Cooney Horvath, all the way from Melbourne by way of Pittsburgh. So the book is called Stop Talking, Start Influencing, although for this audience, most of us being educators, it could actually be Start Teaching. It's available now, or it's going to be available soon?
It comes out, March 12th in the U.S.
Okay. All right. And Amazon and all the normal places? All
the fun places should have it.
Okay. Social media or any other places you want folks to check you out and find you?
I'm occasionally on Twitter at JC Horvath, but most of my tweets are sports related. So if you're really into the Pittsburgh Penguins hockey team and you want updates, that's the place to go.
Got it. That's funny. Okay, well, Jared, it's been really, really fun talking with you. This is certainly right in my wheelhouse, and I appreciate the time, and hopefully folks will check out the book. I think it's worth checking out, especially I like the pieces of, if you're a teacher, this is how you can use this on each of those pieces, so I appreciate it.
I love it. Thanks for having me on. This was great.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, teachthought.com and wegrowteachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.